Today we're looking at Slim in Of Mice and Men, an interesting character, maybe not the most obvious character that you would think to write about, but really interesting and really important within the novel. The first thing that I would say is that there's a real contrast between Slim and Curley. So Slim is represented very much as a natural leader. He has this authority in the ranch through the respect that other people have for him. If you look at the way that he's described when he's first introduced, it says there was a gravity in his manner and a quiet so profound that all talk stopped when he spoke. His authority was so great that his word was taken on any subject, be it politics or love. He's the man that they all look to. And when he speaks, they're silent because they respect him and his views and his words so much. He's in effect, he has so much authority, so much respect within the ranch that he's like the boss in that sense. He might not have the financial status. You might not have that kind of that economic status over them in the same way that the boss does, because the boss is the one with the land and the one with the money. But Slim actually is the one who they look to. He's the one that they he's a decider, he's a judge in many respects, and we'll be looking at that a bit later. Look at Candy and the way that when Candy's dog, there's the threat that Candy's dog will be shot in chapter 3. And ultimately, when Carlson is saying, oh no, the dog really smells, Candy looks to Slim. And it says, Candy looked helplessly at him, for Slim's opinions were law. And he recognises that if Slim says, yes, shoot the dog's going to be shot. It's Slim ultimately is the one that's going to make that decision. There's a real contrast there, isn't there, to Curley. The power, any power that Curley has within the novel, it's through fear and intimidation, as represented by his hands. Hands are really important, aren't they, in the novel, symbolically. And at one point, his hands are described as being closed into fists. He's a very defensive character, very hostile, very aggressive, but the fists, I think, represent the idea that people are afraid of doing what he says, partly because they're afraid that he'll pick a fight with them if they don't. Also, of course, it's power by association, isn't it? Because he's the boss's son. If someone steps out of line or upsets him in some way, he can maybe have a word with his dad and get them canned. So there's those two things: the fear of physical conflict and the fear that maybe they might lose their job because he's the boss's son. But it's all based on fear, as opposed to Slim, where it's all to do with respect, isn't it? So make sure you contrast the way that Steinbeck presents those two characters. He very much juxtaposes them in terms of the way that we see them and the way that others respond to them. Slim is composed, mature, and considered in his decisions, whereas Curley, in comparison, comes across as very rash, insecure, and very agitated, I think, all the time. The initial description of him then, lots of words from the semantic field of royalty. Look at this quote. It says, he moved with a majesty only achieved by royalty. And then it goes on to talk about him being the prince of the ranch. He has this natural authority, and people respond to him in the same way that they would a king or a prince when they encounter him. His hands are really interesting. It describes his hands. It says, his hands, large and lean, were as delicate in their action as those of a temple dancer. So his hands are very masculine and strong, but also very refined and skillful. There's nothing blunt or crude about Slim. For instance, it says he was capable of killing a fly on the wheeler's butt with a bullwhip without touching a mule. There's this sense of a precision in everything that he does, and skill, and I think effortless control. He's just a natural at everything he does, and so skillful. His authority, I think, like I was saying, I think leads to him being considered a judge-like character, either to administer justice or to show mercy, or both. And if you look at the crucial points, the crucial moments in the novel, moments like the death of Candy's dog, or the fight between Lenny and Curley, or following the death of Lenny, Slim is there. Slim is the one that will decide ultimately whether Candy's dog gets shot. Slim is the one that tells Carlson how to do it by reminding him to take a shovel. After the death between Lenny and Curley, Slim is the one that comes in and deals with the situation and says to Curley, I think you're going to keep quiet about this, and you're going to say that your hand got caught in the machine. He's the one that resolves the situation and deals with it. Following the death of Lenny, he's the one that kind of scoops up the mess of it all, and then approaches George and then says, you had to, George. Let's go off and get a drink, me and you. So he's the one that deals with conflict, administers justice, or shows mercy. In that respect, he's very much represented as this authority figure in the ranch. A really interesting and important point about Slim, I think, is the integrity he has. He respects others and they respect him, and he's very genuine, very authentic, Slim. And the way in which he treats crooks, I think, is fundamental to this. In chapter 4, when Slim is talking about it's Candy actually coming into Crooks's room, and it's emphasised that Slim is one of the few people, the boss has been in there, but Slim is one of the few people ever to have been in Crooks's room ever. And Candy and Crooks, Candy says, I've been here a long time, and Crooks has been here a long time. I've never been in this room. But Slim, it appears, has. And it maybe suggests that Slim is the one that's prepared to break the expectations of segregation. It says, guys don't come into a coloured man's room very much. Nobody been here but Slim. So there's this sense that, Slim almost sort of ignores the rules of segregation. He treats Slim with treats Crooks rather with a respect that the other men don't. If you look at one of his conversations with Crooks, I think you can see that. I'll just put that on the screen there for you. It says, oh, hello, Crooks, what's the matter? And then Crooks says, you told me to warm up a towel for that mule's foot. I got it warm. Oh, sure, Crooks, I'll come right out and put it on. I can do it if you want, Mrs. Slim. No, I'll come do it myself. Notice the overwhelmingly important thing here is that he calls Crooks by his name. There's no derogatory racist slurs come out of Slim's mouth. And so he just gives Crooks the respect of calling him by his name, just treating him like a normal human being. There's no apparent prejudice and racism in the way that he addresses Crooks at this moment. It's just a very genuine conversation. He has respect for Crooks, respect for his work, respect for his time. Crooks offers to do the work, but Slim says, no, it's all right, now I'll do it. And the way in which he treats Crooks here, who ultimately, of course, is the least powerful person on the ranch because of his race, that tells you so much about Slim as a person, as an individual. He's prepared to give time to and respect the least powerful person on the ranch. It's not just those who can do something for him, not just the more powerful characters that he shows respect to, it's everyone, regardless of their status. He's also comes across as incredibly empathetic, I think, at times. He's a character that George opens up to. You could look a bit more at that earlier in the novel. But the end of the novel, I think, is particularly important when George has just killed Lenny, and the last words in the novel are given to Carlson, who's speaking to Curley right at the end. He says, so he's looking at Slim and George, and Slim goes up to comfort George because he recognises how distressed George is, obviously, at the fact that he's just shot Lenny, or that Lenny has died. And Carlson says this. He says, now what the hell you suppose is in them two guys? Carlson is remarkably unempathetic. It's so shocking. It's mind-blowing. How can you stand there and look at George, who's upset because he's just shot his best friend, and turn to someone and say, well, what's up with them? How can he can't even begin to understand, can he? It's so unbelievable that someone can be so lacking in empathy, Carlson, at that point. But Slim is the very opposite to that, isn't he? Look at the way that he responds to George when he realises what's happened, and he realises how distressed, how completely alone George feels at this moment. There are lots of references on those last couple of pages to the idea that Slim very much physically approaches George, sits down right next to him, talks to him, consoles him, touches him. He offers reassurance and support. Look at how it says Slim came directly to George and sat down beside him, sat very close to him. I've spoken before about how physical positioning is very important and movement are very important within the novel. And here is another example. George is isolated. George is the one that's distressed and needs comfort and reassurance and support. And so Slim comes and sits really close to him, right next to him. He actually touches him, which is so shocking, because when else does anyone touch anyone in the novel? You know, Lenny and Curly touch each other when they're fighting, don't they? But when else is there? And of course, Lenny touches Curly's wife's hair and then breaks her neck. But all the other moments of physical touch, they're examples of conflict, or they lead to disaster. But look at Slim here. It says Slim twitched George's elbow. George let himself be helped to his feet. And to me, I want to really contrast that to the men's response to the shooting of Candy's dog. So I don't know if you remember that moment back in chapter 3, where Candy is lying on the bed and then you hear the gunshot. And it says that he's staring at the ceiling, he hears the gunshot, and it says Candy rolled over and faced the wall. And the men, they're sitting there and they're having a game of cards, but they do nothing. No one approaches him. Candy doesn't reach out to them. He just isolates himself and turns over and faces the other direction and faces the wall. Notice how different this is. And to me, I think there's a glimmer of hope here. In many ways, the novel seems to be moving inevitably towards separation and despair. So away from companionship towards isolation. Yeah, if you think about it, at the beginning of the novel, you've got 3 sets of companions, haven't you? You've got George and Lenny, Candy and his dog, and Curly and his wife. And by the end of the novel, all 3 of those, one of them has, in each of those 3 cases, one of them has been lost, isn't it? So Candy's dog is dead, Curly's wife is dead, and Lenny is dead. So there's this kind of trajectory of the novel, which seems to be moving from companionship and friendship to isolation and separation, isn't there? But this, to me, seems to be a bit of an exception. And it seems to be, I think Steinbeck is focusing on the idea that, yeah, I know the whole of the novel was moving towards death and disillusionment and despair and disappointment. Of course it was, because the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after Gley. Yeah. But what have we got right at the end here? There's some hope, isn't there? Because in the midst of the bleakest moment of death and disillusionment that you could possibly imagine, a friendship blossoms, doesn't it, between Slim and George on those last couple of pages. I think the pronouns are important here as well. Look at how Slim says, me and you will go and get a drink. Me and you. I can't get over the use of the me and you references in the novel. It's very resonant, isn't it, of Lenny talking to George about the dream back in chapter 1. Do you remember Lenny saying, I got you to look after me and you got me to look after you. I, me, you, me, you. Yeah. And then look at Candy after the death of Curly's wife. And remember when he's petrified that the dream is over. And of course it is. But he pleads with George, doesn't he, Candy, at that moment in section 5. And he says, you and me can get that little place, can't we, George? Can't we? You and me. And I just think there's lots of you and me and yous in the novel. But here, right at the end, there's another me and you, isn't there? There's a new pairing, a new set of companions. And to me, it's almost Steinbeck is emphasizing the idea that you can't destroy the human instinct, the human impulse towards friendship. That's indestructible. Okay. Someone might die, a dream can die. Disappointment and disillusionment can be present. But ultimately, you can't destroy this kind of impulse that we have within us as human beings. to forge a new friendship. The novel begins with two guys, doesn't it? With George and Lenny walking along the path, and Lenny walking behind George. It begins with two guys that appear, doesn't it? Okay, and then in the middle, of course, it's all to do with the creation of hope, and their dreams seem to almost come to fruition, and then there's death repeatedly, isn't there? And then, of course, disappointment and despair. But how does it end? What are the last two words of the novel? Two guys. So the novel begins with two guys and it ends with two guys. Steinbeck seems to like this kind of cyclic structure, doesn't he? There's lots of ways in which you could view the novel in this way. But that might be a way in which you could think of Mice and Men, rather than being a pessimistic novel, which of course generally you would think of it as being very pessimistic, wouldn't you? There is a note of optimism. There is that sense of hope, that sense of new life, something blossoming right at the end.